Welcome to Presentation 12 in the series where we're looking at the book of Deuteronomy. Let's just reflect back on the previous presentation. In chapter 27 it said, Moses and the Levitical priest said to all Israel, "Be silent, Israel, and listen. You have now become the people of the Lord your God. Obey the Lord your God and follow his commands and decrees that I give you today. Be silent and listen." Central point. We need to stop whatever competes so that we can listen to God. It's too easy to kid ourselves that we're listening to God when we're really listening to ourselves. We do need to listen. We need to take it in, and we then have to obey. God had taken this people group from slavery in Egypt, and here were their descendants about to enter a new phase in their life as a people group. And God seeks a response from them. He rescued them. He provided for them. He seeks that they live for him. We live God's way, not the way that suits us. But why did God choose this people group? Does God have favorites? No. And what are the consequences of obedience and disobedience? Are we trying to impress God? No. Let's look at these questions. That's what God had done for them. And survival and protection in the desert area that they'd been through was unbelievably difficult. They certainly did not earn it, and they certainly did not deserve it. They complained and disobeyed throughout. But the reason God chose them had a long-term purpose. It's not because they were special, not because they impressed God, but he had a purpose. He wanted to take this people group, make himself known to them, so that they could make God known to the people groups round about. And they would do that by the way they lived. Quality lifestyle. And that's what this book is all about. Quality lifestyle. But the people had to be willing to go that way. And if they were willing to go that way, oh yes, they would make mistakes. But if they were willing and committed to go that way, God promised protection and provision. But it was for the purpose that they might live the God-like life, quality living, and make God known to the people groups round about. That was God's long-term agenda. It still is today for God's people. The famous chapter 28. This outlines the consequences of obedience and disobedience. How are we going to respond to God after all he's done for us? They were chosen not because they were special, but they were chosen for a task. That's always a biblical idea. Never chosen for heaven, hell, or a destiny, or because you're good enough, or because you've impressed God or kept his rules enough. Chosen for a task. And as long as they pursued that destiny that God had for them, God would be there for them. He wouldn't let them down. And their task was to show the kind of quality lifestyles that reflected the very nature of God himself. And we can see that perfectly in the life of Jesus in due time. And God would protect them, he would provide them, so they could make an impact if that was going to be their agenda. They were going to enter God's agenda and go the way that God had for them. And then God would be made known to the wider world around, and they too would enter into the benefits of quality lifestyle. That's what God has for humanity, quality lifestyle. We think we know better than him, and we mess up. But God continually comes to us, calling us to a higher level of quality lifestyle. And he's there for us in that task. So that's the picture. Lives clearly centered on God and living for Him. That's not to say you wouldn't make mistakes, but committed to living the way God has for us, the best way. God would provide all the necessities of life. God would keep us healthy and rich family lives, growth in the population, when we're living that way. We'll find we're not pushed around endlessly by the events of life, but we can move through them serenely. We can't escape these events, but we can move serenely through them. And all the enterprises we undertake for living for God, they're successful. And we're secure. Oh, how humanity needs security. Secure and fulfilled in all circumstances of life, no matter what life may throw at us. That's the picture of what's available when we go God's way in obedience. But what happens when we go in disobedience is quite simple. These things all start to vanish. And there's a deep, deep message for the people of God in the West today, as some of these things are starting to vanish. Why? Perhaps it goes back to disobedience. We've got to remember in interpreting this book, it's not a book of rules, it's a book of principles, but it's set in a context. The promises and the warnings given here are given in relation to God's people about to enter a new phase of their life together to fulfill the task that God has for them. Not just a comfortable, good and rich life, but to fulfill the task God has for them. And everything is conditional. All these blessings, summarized, will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. If we do it God's way, commit ourselves to living His way, not only will we find life richer and more wonderful, but God will provide everything we need to make Him known to the world around. And God has a long-term purpose. God would establish them as His holy people, set apart for Him, quality living. If you keep the commands of the Lord your God and walk in obedience to Him, we've got to be willing. Then, and that's the purpose, then all the peoples on earth will see that you're called by the name of the Lord and they will fear you. That's to respect you. People sit up and take notice when they meet people who live quality lives, who are there for others, whose agenda is for the benefit of those around, who do not live by a selfish drive. That makes an impact. We just have to ponder the great men and women of God down through the centuries, but most particularly ponder the impact that Jesus made because of the quality of the life He lived. That's the picture for us today. That's the principle behind it all. And when we're going that way, God will provide everything we need to fulfill His task for us. He won't make us multimillionaires, because that doesn't help us fulfill His task. But if we turn from the conditions, we're no longer able to fulfill God's task. We forfeit the provision and protection. And the word curses, if you like, is the non-blessings, the reverse of the blessings. His protection, His provision are withdrawn because they're no use to us, because we're not fulfilling His task. We're wanting them for selfish reasons. Now let's move on into the next section. Moses now challenges the people. It's decision time. He's shown them what God has done. He's shown them what God wants. Now it's over to you. It's up to you. And behind that is the very, very deep principle. Choices have consequences. And in life, as we look over the life and the mountain peaks that lie ahead of us, choices have consequences. And there's a danger if we fail to obey. We decide we want to live our lives for what we want, not what God has for us or wants for us. We lose out. And in this section, Moses imagines that the people have failed totally. And in a real sense, it's prophetic, because they did, again and again and again. They've lost all the blessings. It's all come to happen as God indicated it would. The people have become scattered and powerless. They've even lost the land. Keeping the land is only conditional about doing what God wants. Probably most fundamental of all, they have lost God's life task for them. Oh, we all long for a purpose in living. God has a life task for you and for me. Let's recapture it. Let's seek Him. And let's commit ourselves to find it and live for it His way, following His directions. There is fulfillment. There is security. They lost it. And they were utterly confused. That's the picture that Moses paints. And it happened again and again. You can see it perhaps most clearly in the writings of Ezekiel, when they'd lost the land and were in exile. And the people were utterly lost and confused. Why has this happened to us? What's going on? And bit by bit Ezekiel had to explain to them. They brought it on themselves and explained to them what they had to do to put things right. Into chapter 30 now. When all these blessings and curses I have set before you have come on you, in other words, experience of living, and you take them to heart, wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations, in other words, they've failed, and when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey Him with all your heart and with all your soul, according to everything I command you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where He scattered you. We've got to return to the Lord our God and obey Him, commit ourselves to His way. Even if you've been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. He will bring you to the land that belonged to your ancestors. You will take possession of it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. The Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love Him with all your heart and with all your soul and live. The Lord your God will put all these curses on your enemies who hate and persecute you. You will again obey the Lord and follow all His commands I am giving you today. Then the Lord your God will make you most prosperous in all the work of your hands, in the fruit of your womb, the young of your livestock, and the crops of your land. The Lord will again delight in you and make you prosperous, just as He delighted in your ancestors, if you obey the Lord your God and keep His commands and decrees that are written in this book of the law, and turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Just in passing, this has no connection whatsoever with what's happening in the land of Israel-Palestine today. The Jewish state today is largely secular. They have not returned to the Lord your God, and the only way to return to God is to come to Jesus, as Paul makes clear in the book of Romans. But coming back to the original, remember, curses, it's not some medieval thing, it's just the non-blessings. God steps back and removes things, good things. And remember that the land's possession was tenancy, nothing permanent about it at all. And that's made crystal clear throughout the Old Testament. They would lose the land if they didn't fulfill the task that God wanted for them as a people group. And when they lost it in AD 70, they'd lost it because they rejected the one that God sent, Jesus Himself. There's inevitable consequences, different word. But let's look at the first little bit and focus on it, and the last little bit. when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart, that's the seat of decisions, with all your soul, that's your actions, according to everything I command you today. That's the conditions. Same thing is repeated at the end in a sense. If you obey the Lord your God and keep his commands and decrees that are written in this book of the law, and turn to the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your whole being, I want to do it God's way. I want to live for God. I want to make God known to the world around. I do not see that happening today. Focusing on the first 6 verses, we could see it as coming to your senses. Recognition that decisions and actions of the past have consequences. When the people in exile in the days of Ezekiel, when their leadership, when the penny began to drop and they came to their senses, Ezekiel could make progress. And it took him a long, long time. We need to live God's way. And it's got to be God's way. Not a way that we've decided and asked God to rubber stamp. God's way. And the evidence of the first 2 is in our actions. Coming back again to the Middle East today, is bombing innocent people evidence that they've come to their senses and returned to the Lord? Then God will be able to restore. God was able to restore in the days of Ezekiel and following that, when they were restored back. But they were only restored back partially because they had only responded partially. They were never a free nation, ever again. And in a sense they're not free today, because without American aid they would not survive. The land is critical, but only critical in the sense that it gives you a jumping off point, a position of security to make God known to the world around. And if that's not the objective, the land is irrelevant. Expanding what once they had, God could do it. Circumcising the hearts, God would enable them to obey and live his way, and it can be painful. We'll return to circumcising the hearts in a moment. Full restoration is possible. Not certain, but possible. But it's dependent on this. Total return to the Lord. And there's messages for the people of God in the West today in this. That's how Moses put it. Obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, your decision taking and your actions. According to everything, we're committing ourselves to live God's way completely. You see, Moses then was speaking to a people group, and their characteristic, you look at all the evidence, is that they were characterized by rebellion, disobedience, and often complaining as well. All over their desert wanderings, that was there. And Moses was so spiritual, he understood spiritually what was going to happen to them. That characteristic wasn't going to disappear overnight. The circumcision. God will enable us to love him with all our heart and with all our soul, and then live. Proper living, not just existence. That's in the verse here. But we've got to remember, there's a verse in the previous chapters addressed to the people, circumcise your hearts therefore. God will enable us to respond to him, but we've got to be willing to respond to him. Our thinking and our decision taking. God does not impose his will upon us. He's given us free choice. When we're willing, he will enable it to happen. And there's a great and deep message for the people of God in the West today. We need to get together, open our hearts to him, recognizing that we made a mess of things, and say, Lord, we want to change. We want to go your way, but we're not quite sure how to do it or even if we're capable of doing it. God will enable it to happen. There's the warning that Moses gave to the people for the future. He knew them too well. He'd lived through it. He was now in great old age. He'd seen it all. He'd been faithful to God. They rebelled, disobeyed, rebelled, disobeyed again and again and again. And he knew and could see what was going to happen. And he's warning them so that they can resist it and remain faithful to God. Back to chapter 30. Going on, Moses says, now what I'm commanding you, speaking for God, today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven, so you have to ask who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it. Nor is it beyond the sea, so that you have to ask who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it. No, the word is very near to you. It's in your mouth, in your heart, so you may obey it. See, I've set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I commanded you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands. In other words, to respond to him. Do it his way. Keep his commands, decrees and laws. Then you will live and increase. The Lord your God will bless you in the land you're entering to possess, to tenant. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land. It's not a permanent possession. You will not live long in the land you're crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. The word destroyed, we have to watch. There are multiple words in the original language. Here the word that's used in the sense of something being undone. If you like, their activities come to nothing. And I've seen so much in churches today where a tremendous amount of effort is put in by wonderful people. But in the end, the fruit is so little. The activities come almost to nothing. Perhaps there's something we've got to rethink here. It's not permanent. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice. Hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, life to the full. He will give you many years in the land he swore to give to your fathers Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Again, remember, the word means just a non-blessing. We miss out on God's best. Moses is now challenging the people. Respond to God. He's done it all for you. He offers you this agreement, this life destiny. Respond. It's not complicated. It's intelligible, accessible and possible. Moses has explained it to them. Moses had the advantage he could read and write. He'd been educated in the Egyptian hierarchy. The people there couldn't, in general. He explains it to them. God's done it. He's shown you by the actions. His preservation of you through the desert, His rescue from slavery, the victories you've had so far. Now live His way. He's got a task for you to make Him known to the world around. And He promises that security and provision for that task. And He's made it clear what He wants from His people. The principles of living the God way, living the Jesus way. And it's all for our benefit. It's not a rule book to put rules and regulations and restrictions on us. It's principles that can liberate us to fulfilled living. And there are two wonderful benefits that come from this. We see God's task being fulfilled. Others are drawn to God. I have seen that in my life and been staggered and amazed when, particularly amongst young people, living for God, amazing things have happened and amazing responses have taken place, responses that now historically have lasted. But I've also seen so much frustration with a tremendous amount of hard work and effort, and almost nothing comes from it. When we're doing it God's way, following His directions, He'll provide that every need we've got will be met. That's the true meaning of the word prosperity. It's not being multimillionaires and possessing things materially. Every need being met. And the word every is important. What a fulfillment that gives. An inner joy, satisfaction. And the true meaning of prosperity. But the chapter ends with these verses. Read them a moment ago. What Moses is challenging the people now as they're about to enter the land. God is willing, and He can, and He's willing. He can do it for us, but the choice is ours. God has given us free choice. He doesn't bulldoze us around. We can go one of two ways. We can listen to what is directed and then follow it. Or we can decide to run our lives our own way for our own supposed benefit. Now we can individualize this, but in the context of the original, this is a people group, the people of God. The people of God today would be the most natural interpretation and translation. Church groups or whatever. Are we listening to what He's directed and following these directions? Or are we running things, running our system our own way, and then perhaps asking God to rubber stamp it? Life and prosperity, blessings. Death and destruction. We get nowhere. We lose out. When we're going that way, God will provide all we need to carry out His life task for us. But things just won't work. And we see in the West today, numerically speaking and very often spiritually speaking, decline, although there are some wonderful signs and shafts of hope here and there. Moses went out and spoke these words to all Israel. I'm now 120 years old and I'm no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you not cross this Jordan. The Lord your God will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you. In other words, they'll lose their power. It's not a wipeout. You will take possession of their land. Joshua also will cross over ahead of you, as the Lord said, and the Lord will do to them as I did to Sihon and Og. They lost their power and control. The kings of the Amorites, whom He destroyed along with their land. The Lord will deliver them to you, and you must do to them all that I have commanded you. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Watch when you see numbers. They didn't live in a quantitative age, didn't use numbers the same way. They didn't even have a number system. It could be idiomatic, meaning 3 generations. In other words, Moses was now at the point where his grandchildren were growing up. Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to them in the presence of all Israel, Be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them. You must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be dismayed. Do not be discouraged. So Moses wrote down this law and gave it to Levitical priests, he could read and write, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. Then Moses commanded them, the end of every 7 years in the year for cancelling debts, during the festival of tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose. You shall read this law before them in their hearing. They couldn't read it for themselves. Assemble the people, men, women, and children, and the foreigners residing in your towns. It was not ethnic cleansing. So that they can listen and learn to fear the Lord your God and follow carefully all the words of this law. Their children who do not know this law must hear it and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land you're crossing the Jordan to possess. Moses, near the end of his life, a man of courage and obedience. He didn't fight the decision that he wasn't going to enter the land. Joshua taking over from the legend. What a terrifying prospect. Leadership is so important, and that is still true today. This law is God's directions for quality lifestyle. We have to watch the word. It's changed its meaning in English, and it's not a rule book. It's directions, a framework. You see, regular public reading was important. It's an oral culture. Now, there are 2 recorded occasions when this actually did happen. One in 2 Kings, when the great king Josiah, the reformer, he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which had been found in the temple of the Lord. The king renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord. Things were pretty bad at that time. He was trying to put them right. And then, much later from Nehemiah, they were returning and had settled back in the land after the time of exile. Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, which was made up of men and women and all who were able to understand. He read it aloud from daybreak till noon. That's some achievement. About to start again, having made a complete mess of it. Get back to the drawing board. Perhaps that's what we've got to do today. Sadly, Hosea observed, My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Because you've rejected knowledge, I have also rejected you as my priests. That could be the whole nation, or it could be in the priestly class. Because you ignored the law of your God, I also will ignore your children. When we don't listen to God and don't make any attempt to do it his way, God withdraws, because our life destiny can't be fulfilled. That's the real warning. Spiritual leadership. How we desperately need that today. And there are wonderful men and women of God who are exerting that leadership, but they're often under great pressure. When leadership goes adrift, things don't half go wrong. And that was happening in the land of Israel, the northern kingdom, the days of Hosea. And it followed in Judah. The Lord said to Moses, The day of your death is near. Call Joshua and present yourselves at the tent of meeting where I'll commission him. So Moses and Joshua came and presented themselves at the tent of meeting. Then the Lord appeared at the tent in a pillar of cloud. And the cloud stood over the entrance to the tent, and the Lord said to Moses, you're going to rest with your ancestors, and these people will soon prostitute themselves to the foreign gods of a land they are entering. They will forsake me and break the covenant I made with them, and in that day I'll become angry with them and forsake them. I will hide my face from them, and they will be destroyed. They'll come to nothing. Many disasters and calamities will come on them. Protection had gone. And in that day they will ask, have not these disasters come on us because the Lord our God is not with us? And I will certainly hide my face in that day because of all their wickedness and turning to other gods. Now write down this song and teach it to the Israelites and make them sing it, so that it may be a witness for me against them. When I brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, the land I promised an oath to their ancestors, and when they eat their fill and thrive, they will turn to other gods and worship them. It's what materialism so often does, rejecting me and breaking my covenant. And when many disasters and calamities come on them, this song will testify against them, because it will not be forgotten by their descendants. I know what they are disposed to do. Even before I bring them into the land, I promised them on oath. So Moses wrote down this song that day and taught it to the Israelites. We'll look at the song in the next presentation. Let's just look at this section. It goes on, the Lord gave this command to Joshua son of Nun. He now turns the leader to be. Be strong and courageous, for you will bring the Israelites into the land I promised them on oath, and I myself will be with you. That's a message that Joshua must have needed desperately. After Moses finished writing in a book the words of this law from the beginning to end, he gave this command to the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Take this book of the law and place it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God. There it will remain as a witness against you, a permanent record, written form. For I know how rebellious and stiff-necked you are. If you had been rebellious against the Lord while I'm still alive and with you, how much more will you rebel after I die? Assemble before me all the elders of your tribes and all your officials, so that I can speak these words in their hearing and call the heavens and earth to testify against them. For I know that after my death you are sure to become utterly corrupt and to turn from the way I've commanded you. In days to come disaster will fall on you, because you do evil in the sight of the Lord and arouse his anger by what your hands have made. Worshipping things. Moses, near the end of his leadership span, the end of his life, God revealed to him the people would persist in rebellion and wouldn't follow his life directions. And Joshua, imagine the new leader, not a young man now, coming into leadership, following the great Moses. The people are going to persist in rebellion, and they won't follow his life directions. But I myself will be with you. Don't give up. Moses' final instructions, if you like, are completed. He's laid the preparations obediently under God for the next stage of this people group's life task. But it's a bit surprising it comes to the end this way. We would expect some kind of triumphant handover leadership and commissioning for a great future, because Joshua was a great man in his own right. God appears to these two leaders, tent of meeting, the place where the worship center of the people of the time, where the ark was kept. And it's words of warning. The people you have led, he says to Joshua, and the people you will lead, he says to Joshua, to Moses and to Joshua, they will rebel, and as a result of that, difficulties and disasters will face them. Comes back to that. We think we know better than God and can run our lives our way. We don't know better than the creator of the universe, and the evidence shows that we humans make an absolute mess of running our lives our own way to our agendas. With the rebellion, God's protection and provision are withdrawn, and that's what happens. Not a rule book that we keep to impress God. It's never written that way, and the language wouldn't allow it to be interpreted that way. It's a set of guidelines and principles so that God's people can live reflecting the nature of God their Maker and make God known to those around, to the watching world. But what about today? There are deep, deep principles here for the people of God, especially in the West. We've got to ask these questions, and we've got to look honestly at them. That's happening in several Western nations. And that's why we, the people of God, have got to get together locally and in communities, pray and open ourselves up, read again from the scriptures and have a look at what God has said and is saying to us, and commit ourselves to living individually and as communities our lives His way. Not only will be the greater satisfaction, but then we can fulfill the task that He has for us, to make Himself known to the watching world. That's what we've done. We think we're so clever. We know more than God. We are clever, very, very clever. He made us that way. But nothing compared to the wisdom of God. And that's what we're doing. Whether it's built around liturgies, sacraments, hymn sandwiches, or even around songs that pretend to be worship. Well, what about Moses near the end of his life? Must have been disappointment with this warning. How did he react? Well, God gave Moses a song, some poetry, for him to recite and teach the people. It was the way that the people could remember, put it in poetic or probably song form. But right to the end, Moses obediently followed God's directions. What an example. But it points to us today what we've got to do to go take things forward. Let's get back to the truth. And by truth I mean that which is based on evidence God has given to us in the Bible. God has given it to us in the life of Jesus. God has given it to us in what Jesus did, said, and commanded. And we've got to take it seriously and obey. It's an interesting observation that in countries where the people of God are under terrible persecution, being a small minority, people are coming to Jesus, looking at what bits of the Bible they can get hold of, because it's restricted, and then simply doing what Jesus says. No religious systems, because they're not allowed. And they're making an impact, and others are being drawn to the way of Jesus. That's the challenge for us today. The next presentation we're going to look at the final events in the life of Moses, particularly the song that he was given and what it says to us about God's ways.